And so we're going through all these scriptures on what happens when you die. And I'm like going, this is not good.
Yeah.
And I just had this sense of just, I am a sinner. I'm going to hell. This is really bad. I need to get saved.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Creation Podcast, where we discuss the science that confirms Scripture. I'm your host, Renee, and we have a very special episode in store for you today. ICR science staff have spent more than 50 years researching scientific evidence that refutes evolutionary philosophy and confirms the Bible's account of a recent and special creation. Through their work, thousands of lives have been impacted with Christ's creation truth. But how does one become a creation scientist? What leads an individual down that particular vocational path? In this series, we'll be taking a look at the lives and journeys of several members of ICR science staff to answer those questions. And before we begin, I would just like to say this is my last podcast here at ICR. I have loved being along this journey with you and have learned so much from our wonderful scientists, and I hope you have too. I'm going to seminary, and I'm so excited for this next chapter, and I will continue to be praying for the work here at ICR and the incredible things that we're doing to impact lives with the gospel. And so with that, joining me today in this episode is ICR geneticist, Dr. Jeff Tomkins. Dr. Tomkins, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, it's great to be here.
Awesome. Well, speaking of the gospel, we're going to be talking actually about your conversion story today, how you came to know Christ, and even more specifically, your creation conversion and how you came to recognize the truth of biblical creation. So to kick things off, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background. Did you grow up in a Christian household, and did you go to church as a kid, and what did that look like?
Well, no, I really did not grow up in a Christian household. My parents took us to church occasionally. That was primarily an Episcopal church. And then we moved across town and occasionally went to a Lutheran church. So, but it wasn't a Christian, based family situation. So, actually, when I was in high school, I was just a wild partier and certainly not doing anything Christian whatsoever. And so after high school, actually, I majored in horticulture because I wanted to know how to grow good weed. So, anyways, so I did 2 years out of community college after high school in horticulture, and then transferred to Washington State University. And right before I transferred to Washington State University, I was driving down the road in my 68 Mustang, which I wish I still had. And, I was just fed up with the lifestyle of partying and getting in trouble. And I just cried out and I said, God, if you are out there, please do something. And I remember that really distinctly. And a few months later, I get up to Washington State University. And just through this sovereign plan of God, I went through all these hurdles and things on campus trying to find a place to live. And I ended up in a dorm there on campus in Pullman, Washington. And I had a Christian roommate in my dorm room that I shared the room with. And so he said, hey, you want to do a Bible study? And I said, sure, that sounds great. And he said, okay. And so we're going through all these scriptures on what happens when you die. And I'm like going, this is not good.
Yeah.
And I just had this sense of just, I am a sinner. I'm going to hell. This is really bad. I need to get saved. And so I went back to my bed after that. There's kind of a separation in the dorm room there. And so I went to my side of the dorm room, and I got in my bed. I remember when our parents took us to this one Lutheran church. I don't remember anything about it, but one thing I do remember is that the pastor at the end of the service said, you need to pray and ask Jesus into your heart. And that was all I remembered from all my church experience. And so I prayed and I asked Jesus into my heart. And I know a lot of people don't feel anything when they get saved, or it's a progressive thing, where they progressively, finally come to the point where they get saved. But I literally felt the Spirit man on the inside of me change. I mean, it was like, whoa, you know. And in fact, it felt so good. I tried it the next night, but nothing happened.
You're like, I want this again. Yeah.
That's right. We just saved once. So.
Wow.
So anyways, that's how I got saved, and incredible. And, you know, there's a lot of events that led up to that were just the sovereign hand of God that I could tell you too, but it would take a long time. But anyway, so that's how I got saved. And, yeah, I remember my parents were kind of wondering what in the world was going on. And, you know, they knew something was totally different. In fact, my mother said to me shortly after that, she said, "Jeff, I'm glad you're not doing what you used to do, but don't you think you've gone overboard with this?"
Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, pretty dramatic conversion, I would say. But, you know, when I first got saved, here I am at Washington State University. I'm getting blasted with evolution from students, from teachers, from professors. And I'm like, you know, I need to deal with this. And so I go to the Christian bookstore that was on campus there. It was just kind of a hole-in-the-wall place. But anyways, so I said, what do you have that can help me, you know, with this evolution origins issue? Mm. And so they say, oh, here's a good book. And so they gave it to me, and it was The Fingerprint of God by Hugh Ross. And so Hugh Ross promotes a system where he claims the days of creation are actually millions of years each. And then he tries to fit, you know, the geological column into that. And of course it doesn't work. But so anyway, so I'm reading through this book, and, you know, I appreciate the fact the guy's trying to do something apologetically, but I'm like, I get to the end of the book and I'm like, I was totally unsatisfied. And I'm like, this does not work. You know, what he's trying to do is a system that it doesn't mesh with the Bible really at all. It just doesn't work. And so I go back to the Christian bookstore and I say, I need something else.
Something's missing. Yeah.
This isn't working. And so they handed me Scientific Creationism by Henry Morris II. And of course, that book changed a lot of people's lives. And so I'm reading through that book, and it like completely meshes science with the scriptures. Good science, you know, with the scriptures. And I'm like, this is awesome. And so then I ordered just about everything ICR had in print at that time. And, you know, this is back in the 1980s where, you know, there's no internet. So you fill out a little form and you put a check in there and you mail it and hope you get something back.
Yeah, what was that like?
Yeah. And so I bought a lot of ICR's material. Dwayne Gish had several books that were really impactful in my early years. But, you know, here I am reading all this creation science material from ICR, and I never dreamed I would actually be working here, you know, many years after that. So I went on to get my bachelor's degree. I actually got a degree in agriculture education so I could, you know, be a high school teacher and teach horticulture like the program I had when I was in high school, because I really admired my high school horticulture teacher and thought, well, that's what I want to do. But I ended up staying and helping out a church there that I was involved in. I didn't feel comfortable leaving town, even though I had a position offered me to teach in the Seattle area. And after a couple of years, I'm like, well, I think I want to teach now and leave town. And I sent out all kinds of applications. I even got certified to teach in Idaho. And I couldn't get anything. And so I did find a position at the University of Idaho, which is only 7 miles away from Washington State University. So you got two major universities right on the border, wow. You know, right next to each other. And so there was a teaching assistantship at the University of Idaho in plant science. And so I got a master's degree in plant science. And it's kind of a rigorous program, really. I had a lot of really tough advisors on my committee that were really, really hardcore. So, but what it did was it prepared me for a PhD program, because literally it was like boot camp for graduate students. I had to learn, you know, how to do research.
Yeah, you built endurance.
Yeah, and my major advisor was he was like a drill sergeant for sure.
That'll do it. Yeah.
So anyways, so I get to the end of that program, and I figure I've had it with school I don't want to go to school anymore. I'm tired of being in school all my whole life.
Yes.
And so I sent out literally 100 different applications.
Wow, 100?
100 to all different kinds of companies and places. And I did get one job offer to work for a seed company. But they said, we want you to come to work for us right now. And I only had like a month or two left in my program to graduate. And I'm like, no, I'm going to graduate.
I'm going to finish this up.
I've been through this, this boot camp experience here, and I'm going to get this degree. So anyways, I got the degree, and I was just visiting my parents who had moved to South Carolina. And I just drove down to Clemson University. They were living in Greenville, which is about an hour north of Clemson. I drove down to Clemson. I said, I wonder what's going on here at Clemson. So I went to the agronomy department there. I think that's what it was called at the time. And they said, oh, we've got a position open to work as a research tech. And so it's with Dr. Shipe. And so I went down to talk to Dr. Shipe, and he said, I want to hire a research technician that wants to get a PhD. And I'm like, no, I've had enough of school, but I need a job. So, well, okay.
I guess so, if you say so.
Exactly. So,
yeah.
So anyways, I went ahead and took the position, and I actually worked there for about a year before I decided to start taking classes. And I had never had a genetics class before in all my previous academic work. I was just scared of it. It just sounded really scary.
Yeah, so it's a fairly recent thing then where you started getting into genetics more.
Yeah. So anyway, I had to take this undergraduate level genetics class that I probably should have had before. And I'm like, wow, this is really awesome. I love this stuff. And I just got an A in it, and actually ended up getting straight A's in my PhD work, all my classes, because I just love genetics. And little did I know that was what, God wanted me to be working in. And so I had a lot of coursework in molecular genetics and classical genetics and physiological genetics and developmental genetics and just every form of genetics you can think of. And so got my PhD in quantitative genetics, which involved a lot of statistical analyses. And but the training I had in my master's degree really worked out for my PhD, because my master's advisor was kind of right on me all the time, do this, do that. And so I was learning how to do research, but my PhD advisor, he was like completely hands off. He was like, yeah, I think you should do a little research in this area, and but you have to come up with something yourself. And
very different approaches.
Yeah, but like I say, God providentially prepared me for that. So I created my own research project and got several good publications out of it, and it went really well. Graduated, got my PhD. And then I was looking around for a job after that, and actually at Clemson University, they had just created a brand new position for an endowed chair in genomics. And so they hired this guy from Texas who was just world famous. And so he started this Genomics Lab at Clemson University, which just grew like wildfire because he was very famous, had lots of grant money. And so I went, I just went over to him and I said, hey, can I work in your lab and do some postdoctoral work? And so I ended up becoming a postdoc in his lab, worked there for several years. Then he promoted me to a non-tenure track faculty member. And so that way I was able to write grants and to get my own grant money and so forth. And so I ended up getting just millions of dollars in federal grants from the National Science Foundation and the NIH. And then this guy who I was working for decided he wanted to move to the University of Arizona. And so he left and went to the University of Arizona. And so I figured, well, I better start looking for a job because the guy I'm working for is leaving. He wanted me to go to Arizona with him, but I didn't want to go to Arizona. So anyway, so I started looking for another job, and Virginia Tech ended up offering me a really good position, actually. And so I thought I was going to Virginia Tech to become a faculty member there. And Clemson counter-offered and said, hey, we'll make you a faculty member on the spot, tenure track faculty member. In fact, we'll give you this entire third floor of this building for your lab, a brand new biotech building they had built. And so basically, I took over the Genomics Institute there in place of the guy that left. Ran that for a number of years, and so of course I was teaching teaching introductory genetics. That one class that I had avoided like the plague as an undergraduate. Here I am now teaching it. So I was teaching it to pre-med students, but it was a pretty big class. I had about 120 students in there, and I was teaching graduate level genomics classes and all that. So, but anyways, I had started to build a relationship with some of the faculty here at ICR. And they had this International Plant Genome Conference in San Diego every year in January. And so I would go to that every year, present my research, and interact with other academics and people I was collaborating with. And at that time, ICR was in San Diego. And so once I thought, I'm just going to head over to ICR and check things out, see what's going on. So I met Dr. Frank Sherwin there. I guess he wasn't a doctor at that point, but I met Frank Sherwin and began interacting with him. And then after ICR moved to Dallas, then they had a project going on here with a geneticist named John Sanford, and it was called the Gene Project. And so I flew out to ICR and worked on that a little bit, did that several different times. And the second time I came out, Henry Morris III, who was the president of ICR at that time, offered me a job. And, it was a tough decision because I had a good job at Clemson. And, I enjoyed what I was doing. And, but I really felt, that was God's leading to come here, because when you work at a big university, you can't really openly share your faith or say anything bad about evolution, at least in the classroom or whatever, or you'll basically get fired. So I thought, why spend the rest of my life in a place where I can't, have an impact for the kingdom of God? If I go to ICR, I can use the rest of my life and devote it in all my talents to the kingdom of God and creation science. So that was almost 16 years ago. And so I came out in 2009. And it took me a while to wrap stuff up at Clemson. I had a PhD student that I needed to get through the program. So he graduated, and most of my grant money was done. I had a year left on one grant, and I just gave it to another faculty member. Of course, he was really happy about that.
It's like, I'll take it.
Yeah, really. So anyway, so it was just a good point to kind of wrap things up at Clemson and then move to Dallas. And, I just see God's sovereignty in his hand over my entire life and in all of this, him preparing me, to come to ICR and to have an impact here.
Yeah, absolutely. And he has done incredible things through you in your time at ICR with your research, particularly in genetics. And as you were talking through your story, I was also thinking just of God's sovereignty and how he providentially placed people and resources in your life at just the times you needed them.
Yeah, right.
Even calling to mind your pastor's words from when you were a kid of just, you pray and you ask the Lord into your heart and you're saved. I mean, every little detail, the Lord had planned that beforehand, before you even knew him. And even just how full circle it is that you were changed by scientific creationism by Henry Morris, and now you work at ICR. It's incredible.
It is. It's amazing. So, that first book I read by Henry Morris II, Scientific Creationism, that was a lifeline for me because, here I am, a brand new Christian. I'm getting bombarded with all this evolution in deep time. And that book came at just the perfect time.
Yeah. So whenever you maybe briefly attended a Lutheran church or other churches growing up, did you remember hearing anything about creationism, or did they talk about Genesis, or what was that like?
No, I don't. In fact, the Lutheran church that my parents occasionally, not regular whatsoever. Most of the time they dragged me up there. I had a hangover and wasn't paying attention whatsoever.
I don't remember anything.
But I do remember that one brief, thing the pastor said at the end of his service, and that, God caused that to stick in my brain, and Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, really total providence at work at every step.
Yes. Yeah. And so he used all those events, of course, for your good and for his glory to lead you here to ICR, which is awesome. And so with that, you've, of course, worked on a lot during the past 16 years. Do you have favorite projects or most impactful projects that you've worked on in your time in the ministry?
Yeah. So when I first get to ICR, Henry Morris III sat me down and another biologist that was here, who's no longer here. He went to work at a Christian college. So he sits us down and he says, we hear in churches, quite frequently people are asking, are humans and chimps 98 to 99% similar in their DNA? He says, we get this all the time and we don't have any answers. He said, I want you two to work on this project, and I want an answer in 6 months.
No pressure.
And I didn't say anything. I had just got here, and I had never done anything like that when I was at Clemson. So, I mean, I researched plants and insects and sea creatures, but never humans and chimps. So, so I didn't say anything. But the guy that was the other scientist sitting next to me said, Henry, it's going to take longer than 6 months.
Yeah.
So anyway, so he ended up actually leaving not too long after that, this other scientist. And so the whole project was kind of on me. So I began looking into the human-chimp DNA similarity issue. And so the first place you start is you look at what's been published in the scientific literature. And so there was basically 6 major papers that were proclaiming 98.5% DNA similarity between humans and chimps. And so I looked at these 6 papers, and I noticed one common theme amongst all the papers. They were cherry picking the data. In other words, they were taking sequences from chimp and human that were known to be highly similar and comparing those and leaving out everything else. So all of the material that was not similar was not being reported on. And there were actually some papers where I could kind of factor back in the DNA sequence that they had thrown out. And so I figured out anywhere from about a 66 to an 85% DNA similarity between humans and chimps, just based on what I could see in these papers and what was thrown out and factoring it back in. So at that point, I thought, there's some serious monkey business going on here in the human and chimp DNA comparison area of science. So I figured, well, I'm going to have to start downloading my own DNA sequence and working with that.
Wow. And
so I began doing that, and it was really kind of a can of worms that I had opened up. And so, in fact, one particular study I showed that the chimpanzee DNA sequences that were basically produced during there was an initial chimpanzee genome project that resulted in a 2005 paper, and then that project also extended a few years beyond after that as well. So the one thing I found out is that the chimp DNA sequence in the first half of that chimp genome project was 6 to 7% more similar to human than the work that was done after that paper was published. And so I did that using a relational database and the chimpanzee DNA sequence data, which also had a lot of metadata connected to it as well. So in other words, the year the sequence was produced. And so anyways, so I immediately knew what was going on, because papers at the same time as I was doing that research were being published showing that there was a lot of human DNA contamination in many databases, including bacterial genomes that were being published that had human DNA in them.
Oh, wow. So it was really affecting the results.
Yeah. In fact, there was one paper that was published showing that 3 million bases on zebrafish chromosome number 3 was entirely human.
Oh, that's not right.
Yeah. So as what's going on is during that period of genomics, there's DNA floating around in the air through the heating and air conditioning system. There's DNA on your fingertips, and when you sneeze or you cough, and so there's literally human DNA floating around that gets in these reactions. And so in my opinion, and based on the data that I had, it looked like a lot of human DNA was ending up in the chimp genome project, just like it had other genome projects. Mm-hmm. Wow. And so that was kind of a rough hurdle to deal with. I mean, how do you figure out DNA similarity if there's contamination? But in fact, it's even worse than that, because all these early versions of the chimpanzee genome were put together based on the human genome.
So they're using it as a template.
They're using it as a template, or we call it a scaffold. And so the human genome was put together very methodically, piece by piece. I mean, there's billions of dollars poured into the Human Genome Project. And you've got labs all over the United States, in England, in Europe, in Japan. And so it was just a huge project and meticulously put together. Well, with the Chimpanzee Genome Project, they didn't have that much money. And so what they did is they created all these millions and millions of snippets of chimpanzee DNA. And so how do you put all those together, and how do you put them in order and recreate chimp chromosomes and stuff? Well, they said, well, humans and chimps, are 98% similar, and so we'll just use the human genome to sort out all this chimp DNA. And so they assembled it onto the human genome as a scaffold. And so here you have DNA that's contaminated with human DNA, at least 6 to 7%, maybe more, and you're putting it onto the human genome. So what do you think you're going to get? You're going to get a humanized version of the chimp genome.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of dealing with this, but at that stage of the game, I'm thinking, well, it looks to me like the human and chimpanzee genomes are no more than 85% similar from what I can tell. Well, shortly after that, a brand new DNA sequencing technology came out. It's essentially a sequencing by synthesis, where you can create, instead of chunks of DNA that are only, say, 300 to 1,000 bases long or DNA letters long, you can create pieces of DNA that are 30,000, sometimes up to 50,000 bases long.
Oh, wow.
And so in that kind of a situation, you can pretty much figure out whether you've got human DNA contamination or not. And plus, you can assemble those long pieces of DNA together, not using the human genome as a scaffold. They call it a de novo assembly. So based on the overlaps between these long pieces. So I'd done a number of studies using the old chimp DNA from that previous technology. And when this new technology came out, I began downloading, these huge pieces of DNA. And the ones I downloaded on average were about 30,000 bases long. And so using an algorithm, it's called a pairwise algorithm, I matched those onto human. The one thing I found out is that on average, I could only get 30,000 or 10,000 of those 30,000 bases to even align onto human, because the algorithm would hit a chunk of DNA that had such a huge gap in it that the algorithm couldn't go through that gap and keep aligning the nucleotides. So based on that, and I did 18,000 of those huge pieces of DNA onto human. I found out that based on that, which I consider that to be uncontaminated DNA, that the human and chimp genomes were no more than 84% similar.
Even lower than your initial estimate.
Yeah, a little bit lower.
Wow.
So at that point, I kind of quit working on that project.
Yeah, and how long did that take? I assume not 6 months.
No, let me think. Yeah, I'm thinking probably 8 to 10 years to just. I published multiple papers and looked at the data from multiple angles and using multiple types of tools and bioinformatic tools and things.
Yeah.
So at that point, I'm thinking, well, I don't know what else I can do. And of course, people are attacking me and saying, attacking my research and saying Tomkins really messed up. He's just way off on this. And you've got tons of YouTubers that are evolutionists that aren't even geneticists, but yet attack you and throw stuff out there. But I was actually vindicated on that this past year, because a paper was published in Nature, and there's a huge genome lab up in Seattle, and it's run by a guy named Evan Eichler, who's world famous for DNA sequencing and genomics. And he resequenced all of these ape genomes, including chimpanzee, and actually made these incredible end-to-end assemblies or sequences that were pretty much contiguous. And so he created kind of the ultimate chimp genome that you could compare to human. And so they published a paper just a few months ago, and it was a 17-page paper, but they never really mentioned what the exact nucleotide pairwise identity was in the paper. In fact, they were trying to kind of like reinforce this near similar meme, and I'm going like, there's something missing here. And so they had supplemental material. And the supplemental material, if I'm not mistaken, was about 170 pages long.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, it was just full of all the data, from these studies. Mm-hmm. And buried, I think the page was like page 30 to 33 or something like that. Buried in this material, they had this table with the pairwise identities between humans and chimps. And it was 84%.
Exactly what you said.
Exactly what, yes. And so...
Wow. So you have that secular journal that's now citing your research, or, I guess vindicating, not maybe
No,
citing,
they didn't cite it.
Not citing.
They probably knew about it.
They probably knew about it.
That's why they buried it.
Yes, but I should say, like, even just independently coming up with their own conclusion and then burying it deep within their paper. And what's interesting, too, is that same research group in 2018 did a version of the chimpanzee genome that was supposed to be end-to-end as well, but it wasn't quite as good as the one they just did. And they literally said in that, and they created the chimp genome in that paper based on its own merits. They didn't assemble it onto human. And you know what they said in that paper in 2018? It was a science paper. And of course, these are Nature and Science are like the top journals. They said that because in the past, the chimpanzee DNA had been assembled onto human, they literally said the previous versions of the chimpanzee genome were humanized. They admitted to a lot more in that paper than they did in this most recent one. You're correct. Yeah. No, I mean, it's crazy to think of like the evolutionary bias that those scientists who said the 98.5% similarity, going in, like where they were literally just assuming, well, chimpanzees and humans are similar. Let's just, use the human DNA as a template, and I just think that's a huge, point that we should, as creationists, be aware of, is that with so much of what we see, it's evolutionary bias coming into that research first and foremost. Yeah, well, I saw that when I was working at Clemson University. I was involved in the rice genome project, which was a huge genome project because rice, feeds the world, and rice is also a grass, and so it's considered to be the model grass. And so we put together the rice genome. We at Clemson, we were sequencing a couple of chromosomes that we were assigned to sequence, and other labs around the country and world did other chromosomes. But anyways, so we had this rice genome, this model grass genome or monocot genome. And we thought, or I wasn't really thinking this, but the people in my scientific community who were evolutionists were saying, oh, we can use rice to find genes in barley or corn or other monocots or other grasses because of this evolutionary mindset. So I worked on this project with a barley researcher at Washington State University, of all places, where I came from. And we were going to use rice to find fungal resistance genes in barley. And we immediately found out that this whole evolutionary concept that all the genes should be in the same place, in the same order, we can just use those in rice and transfer it to barley, completely fell apart. The barley genome was entirely different than rice. And so that project lasted maybe 6 months. So that lasted 6 months.
Right, well, less than that, actually, because this isn't going to work.
Yes, yeah.
So, but that's the mindset, this evolutionary mindset that's out there, and then they go to apply it to something, and it just falls apart.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and I just commend you. I mean, that 10 years of that tedious work, I mean, that's a lot. And the Lord is using that for so much good. We even have a display in our Discovery Center with your chimp genome research.
Right.
And so people can come here to Dallas, or they can find your research on ICR.org and in various journals as well, which is so exciting. And so, I think this series that we're doing, where we're talking about creation conversions, I'm hopeful that it gets people thinking, if they were considering a career in creation science, what that could look like. But for those interested, how would they know they might be, being called to pursue creation science and go into that field like you did?
Well, I think, God has to sovereignly put that desire in your heart to really have a hunger for creation science. And you'd be surprised at all the young kids and young, even teenagers and kids even younger that come through ICR and that have that passion. And I think God has put that in them. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, if that is your passion, you feel like that's what you want to do, get a bachelor's degree from a good university. And there's even some Christian ones where you could start, like Liberty University or some places like that. And then go on and get a grad. Now you can get a PhD directly without having to get a master's degree. So I'd say get your bachelor's degree, and it would probably help you if you got your bachelor's degree at a secular university to get into a big research university to get your PhD. So anyways, the nice thing about getting your PhD is that you will get paid to get your PhD.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's really cool.
And so you'll get a salary. You may have to do a little teaching, but typically you get what's called a research assistantship. So when a professor applies for a grant, he puts in salaries in there for like technicians, postdocs, and PhD students. So in other words, you get a paycheck, your tuition is paid, it doesn't cost you anything, you don't have to go in debt.
Wow,
and
lots of good perks.
It's a great opportunity,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
And then after that, it's good to do at least one postdoctoral fellowship, which means it'd be good if you went to yet another big university and did a postdoc for about 2 years. And then after that, decide, what do I want to do? Do I want to work in academia, or maybe private industry, or maybe even find a job, in creation science? That's kind of limited because there's just a limited number of organizations doing creation science research. Or you could go to a Christian university and work there and still be involved in creation science.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's really helpful. And, you mentioned that, of course, when you were in undergrad and going through school, you were indoctrinated with the evolutionary worldview, as I know many of our scientists were. I know I was, a lot of our listeners were, just going through high school, college.
Oh, yeah.
So do you have any advice, especially for those pursuing creation science as a career? Do you have any advice in just countering that worldview and navigating modern academia?
Yeah, my one of my main pieces of advice would be to keep your mouth shut. Do not approach your professors and try and correct them, or try and say, hey, you're wrong on this. That's, try and correct them on their evolution. Mm-hmm. Just keep your mouth shut. Be friendly and nice. Work hard. Get good grades. But yeah, at the same time, it's good to read creation science literature like I did, because that's encouraging, to do that. So just get some good books, from ICR or another organization, and stay current on creation science. And but no, when you're in school, just pretty much hang low, because I had a really bad experience as an undergraduate. It didn't relate to creation or evolution really, but I had an ecology professor I tried to invite to church, and it just completely backfired on me. He was just really ugly to me after that. It affected my grade in the class. And so, I would just say, do not challenge these professors in class. Just work hard, get good grades, stay edified, go to church and hang out with other Christian college students and read the Bible and pray. And so
yeah, well,
every day.
Yes. Well, and something I think it's such an encouragement about your story in particular is how after you became a believer, when Jesus enters our hearts, we aren't the same. And so like even your mom saw that something was different about you. And so I think that's something else, just as we're going through academia and we're encountering these professors, even if they're hostile, that, our faith is reflected in our actions. And so they can see you working hard. They see you pouring your heart into your work and just being a good student and being a light. And that's a real witness.
Yeah. I mean, I remember sitting in lectures where the professor was complaining about students that were creationists, trying to correct them and, them saying they didn't like it. And in fact, even in my genetics class, the first one I took at Clemson, that I had to go and take, that I didn't take early. I remember that professor he said a lot of stuff that was really hostile to Christianity. And in fact, he even made one comment once, how we need to get the blood from the Shroud of Turin and clone Jesus. And just crazy stuff like that was just obnoxious. And I know there were Christians in there that were going up to him and because they didn't like that stuff, but I just, I can't change this guy. That's who he is. And, I'm just gonna learn genetics and get a good grade and, move along with what God wants me to do. So,
yeah,
that you can get provoked by these professors. They will say stuff in class that you want to, counter, and if God tells you to do that, okay. But, my suggestion would be just, you can't really change these guys.
Yeah.
They're going to do what they're going to do. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And what a relief that we don't have the power to change hearts. It lifts the burden off recognizing only the Lord can change them. All we can do is pray and be faithful. Yeah.
But you should be aware of that. You will get, if you're at a big secular university, you will get professors that will say stuff that will, get you worked up.
Yeah. And he is still sovereign. And, just as we wrap things up, of course, you talked about your research and just how the Lord led you to ICR. And so I would just love to ask, what would you say is the most rewarding part of being a creation scientist or even just working at ICR?
Well, it's all the feedback I get, feedback from people when we go out speaking or feedback I get in the mail. People send me letters about articles I write and say, oh, this helped me so much and thank you so much. And it's all that feedback, that I get from people that it's actually helping. And so that's really rewarding. It's also rewarding to see that when you dig into the science, it supports creation. It does not support evolution. That's very rewarding to dig up that data and say, wow, yes, this is awesome. So,
yeah, that's amazing. Well, Dr. Tomkins, we are so grateful for you here at ICR.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you would like to add as we wrap up today's episode?
No, not really. I think we've covered just about everything. I mean, I've had some other research projects I worked on, but I think it would take too long to get into all of that. But I think what I talk about will kind of give you a good idea of
awesome.
What I've been doing. So
for sure. Well, in this episode, this series in general, such an encouragement to me. And this has been so fun talking with you today as well. And I just pray that it touches the hearts of many and just maybe stirs people who are considering creation science to venture down that road. It's incredibly, challenging at times, but also extremely rewarding. And above all, I just pray that this touches people for Jesus and leads them closer to him. So
Amen.
Thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Awesome. And to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Creation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to like, subscribe, and please share it with your friends and family and everyone you know, because it is really our heart to reach as many people as possible with the creation message and ultimately with the gospel. If you see these names right here, these are our members and patrons on YouTube and Patreon. And so you too can get your name on this list. And in the meantime, while these names are scrolling, Dr. Tomkins, I have one more question for you. This is from Timothy Jeffries. And he asks, why is a 6-day literal creation relevant today? Why not just avoid it as a controversial secondary issue?
No, it's really an important issue because it has to do with your perspective on Scripture. Is Scripture inspired from beginning to end, or is it not? So a literal Genesis is important to many issues, including the gospel, because Adam and Eve were made on day 6 of creation. They were literal people. And so when they fell in the garden, shortly after that, it created a sin problem, because everyone who has ever been born since then has a sin nature. Call it total depravity. So that's just a fact. And so everyone needs to get saved. Many people don't. They reject the gospel. But that's why a literal Genesis is so important. Also, you can't say, well, I don't want to believe the first couple of chapters of Genesis and believe the rest. Well, why don't you just disbelieve the whole thing? And so,
yeah.
And on top of that, the scientific data supports a young Earth. And most of that data comes from the global flood. And so, you know, there really isn't any good scientific data to compromise on a literal creation week. And of course, the literal creation week is very specific. Each day is quantified by a number, day 1, day 2, day 3, and so on. Each day is quantified by morning and evening. And it's also mentioned in Exodus twice, talking about the creation week and relating that to the Sabbath. And so, you know, the creation week is fully supported. Also, Christ himself talked about, you know, Adam and Eve, and since the beginning and so forth, and made comments like that. And so, you know, if our Creator, the Lord Jesus Christ, believes it was a literal week, then it's you better believe it's true. And plus, we have these detailed chronologies and genealogies in Genesis and throughout the Bible that go back man by man to Adam and the creation week. And so there's so many reasons to support it. And yeah, I know it can be uncomfortable if you're around people that want to believe the Earth is millions or billions of years old. You know, they've been deceived. They've been indoctrinated by the system, you know, that we find ourselves in right now in the world. And so I would just say stick to your guns and study the issue. There's lots of articles out there on our website and other creation websites on the importance of a 6-day creation. And so, yeah, I would just read some articles on it, you know, get your ammo together on defending that. And don't be ashamed of it. You know, this is the inspired word of God. It is inerrant, and you can trust it. And it's quite clear. It's not something mystical where you can add all these, you know, these ideas of deep time to. You know, it's very clear as to what went on in the book of Genesis in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen to that. And, you know, what a wonderful way to wrap up this episode on your creation conversion. And so thank you again for coming on the podcast today. And to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you again for tuning in. And like I said, if you would like to be part of this list of members and patrons, you can click the link in the description below to become a member on YouTube or Patreon. And with that, we will see you next time on the Creation Podcast.